Hello and welcome, Exiles. Nerf patch notes, buff patch notes, what's the real answer? Let's try to find out. Yesterday, I took my entire stream to try to answer this question. I would poll chat, and I would ask them, is this mastery a buff, a nerf, or a side grade? They would all vote on it, and then I would speak to my reasoning about looking at these two things. Why do I think it's a buff? Why do I think it's a nerf? And today, I'm going to go through you with that, with my bullet point reasons for each point. And at the end of all of this, when we get all the way to an end, I also tally up some miscellaneous things, some ascendancy things, skill balance things, item things, and we have a tally at the end for, in total, number of buffs, number of nerfs. Now, that doesn't cover everything, because some nerfs are slight nerfs, but I still count them as a nerf. Some buffs are slight buffs, but I still count them as a buff. It doesn't give you the full picture, because some buffs are insane, and some nerfs are really over heavily handed, right? Stuff like that, there is basically a measurement to it, but how do you measure that? It's kind of a hard thing to quantify. That I'm going to leave up to you, the viewer, to decide after this video, but I'm going to lay it on the table. From my perspective, obviously I have my own bias, so you need to make your own thoughts based on what I'm telling you. So, going through it one by one, accuracy masteries. We lost precision reservation and 30% if you haven't killed recently. I would argue if you compare this node to a node that has 50% accuracy at close range, this is just strictly stronger, and in most cases when you're attack-based characters, you are up close and personal with the bosses, and so this one I would just think is an overall buff. And then you compare this thing to this thing, this basically doubles your efficiency on mana, versus this thing gives you half the power of precision. So I think it would be more powerful to get half the power of precision, because at the late game this is 300 flat accuracy, precision at level 20 gives you about 600 to 700 accuracy. I would think this is arguably just a stronger node. So that's why I argued for buff. Chat voted buff. I'm not sure why. And then on top of that, you also have instackers that aren't wanders that now get to cap their accuracy. So instackers that aren't wanders got a nice buff as well. All right, moving on. Armor masteries. The big boys you have to think about is determination versus 1 max all res. Ultimately, these other 3 nodes aren't too used in my opinion. I almost never took these other nodes, versus I did take determination, reservation efficiency, and that's the big boy you're looking at. And then you're comparing it to what did you get in return, and I would say this is maybe good on a strength stacker. It's probably a pretty good node on a strength stacker, quite frankly, but outside of that, I don't really see these 2 nodes being used. It's pretty much the 1 max res versus the determination efficiency. Personally, I think 1 max res is stronger than the reservation efficiency. I don't know if that's why chat voted it as a buff, but that's why I voted as a buff, but I think it's only a slight buff, considering this reservation efficiency, and this goes for all the reservation masteries, because pretty much every build, you usually get 1 or 2 of these 25%ers. This gets counterbalanced easily with the mana reservation mastery. It comes with a downside of you have to usually spend 3 points to get 2 points of mana and 1 point of reservation efficiency, but generally speaking, that percent mana isn't completely useless, because it does solve a portion of your mana problem. Depending on how big your mana problem is, you might have to put less investment in terms of minus mana cost on every single jewelry slot. It might just be 2 of your jewelry slots instead of 3 for an example, if that makes any sense. Now, moving on, armor and energy shield masteries. This isn't even close in my mind. The one usable thing was this node on a juggernaut, like if you're deleting your energy shield with RF for some extra armor. But ultimately, these other things I just don't think are very good. But when you compare it to what this mastery set got, it's not even close. And I think that's basically because of this node here. 10% armor also applies to chaos damage. If you've ever played Juggernaut, you know this is disgustingly strong. But I'll break it down for you even further. I'll give you the tech. Divine Flesh plus Juggernaut, you're gonna be nigh immortal. You're splitting up the damage into 2 pools, Chaos and Elemental, and your armor gets to mitigate both more effectively because you're taking basically half the chunk of the damage. It works fantastically. Not only that, you also get some other bangers like 10% Fizz taken as Chaos. Fizz taken as Chaos is very, very good. And if you're combining it with this, it makes your armor that much more effective against physical hits. On top of that, the other things it got, the recover when you take a physical, this is decent. It's a nice little response of like 5% whenever you get hit by something. I would take it in a lot of cases, I think. And then this one, I think it feels too bad conditionally, as well as this one is decent if you happen to meet this condition, because 100% increased armor and energy shield on a Giga Chad Saintly male with like 1500 armor, 300 ES, that does impact your build quite well, but you have to kind of meet this condition, and that's going to be a hard condition to meet. Anyways, that's why I voted a buff. I don't know about chat, maybe something similar. Armor evasion masteries. For me, this node right here is the winner. This basically, if I'm ever taking Armor Evasion Masteries, this is an easy pickup for a way for me to deal with Bleed, one of the deadliest ailments in the game, or if I have bad Chaos Res, getting immune to poison is going to stop you from dying to poisons on a regular basis. This is a go-to pickup. In exchange, Armor Stackers got nerfed. I think pretty much the majority of builds that could fall under the category of having some of our armor and evasion, I think I'd rather have this than this node, unless I'm an armor stacker where I'm really juicing this and I'm really min-maxing this node here. The other things we got in exchange as well, this regen node's kind of interesting, and the other nodes are a little bit weird, a little bit wacky. Stun block recovery, not sure I really care, but overall I think this is a significant or a decent buff. Attack masteries, it's not even close to comparable, except if you're a strength stacker, in my opinion. The things we got in exchange were basically something that feels like you can leap slam into a pack and all of a sudden you get a really fast attack. I think this is going to feel really good for clear, for melee-based characters where you're jumping into packs and then doing damage, because it seems like you're just all of a sudden getting a jackload of attack speed when you really need it most. I think that's fantastic. Not only that, expedition monsters, if you're doing expedition, the mod that bricks your character a lot is the block mod, and it comes up a lot, and this gives you a way to get around that. Maybe use it in some other scenarios, but mostly this just seems like a huge QOL if you want to try to enjoy expedition. Now you can actually be an attack based character and enjoy expedition. On top of that, adrenaline, I think this is one fantastic node, especially for leveling and extra juice for speed. You can't go wrong there. This is basically just a wording change, that's all this is. And then the nearby enemies intimidate is just a little bit more efficient than this node is, because it's a little bit easier to get rage, and ruthless is not something you always want to be using. It's a little bit more generically useful for builds that aren't just like in your face melee, they're actually like a ranged bow character, for example. And then this node also got moved to two-hand melee, so it just makes a little bit more sense in two-hand melee anyways, because that's the build where you're more likely to use ruthless to begin with. Next up, we have caster masteries. This was across the board. We all agreed this was just a nerf. They gave us this meme option and two other options that are like, I don't know. There might be some cool cast while stunned build. If there is, great. But ultimately, you're just losing a useful node here and a semi-useful node here. Caster Masteries weren't great to begin with. This is mostly just an in-stacker nerf with a buff for basically no one unless there's a cast when stun build. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to think about a cast when stun build right now, but I'm sure somebody will do it. Maybe, if they're crazy enough. Of course, next we got Chaos Masteries. This one, no disagreement here between me and chat. This is 100% a nerf. I look at it as they got a nice node in return. They got 10% more damage to enemies that have energy shield. This works on most bosses, but an enemy like Kosis in Simulacrum, for example, that guy has Chevron's effect, so you have to hit his energy shield first. It's weird, but for most bosses, this will be 10% more damage. Unfortunately, both of these nodes are roughly like 10% damage nodes or close to it, so it's like you traded one 10% more damage node for two 10% more damage nodes. So it's just kind of a nerf, I think, straight up. Next up, Claw Masteries. We traded a decent set of Claw Masteries for a better set of Claw Masteries. Basically, maybe there's something where you do dual wield claws. You get instant leech, which sounds nice. You get the ability to do a attack speed bonus. The dual wield claw is interesting. We'll see if it actually pans out. And then the poison, one of the best claw nodes. It got moved to a more appropriate place. It got moved to the Poison Mastery, which I think makes a lot more sense. Having that be on claws didn't really make sense to begin with, so having enemies poisoned by you can't deal crits onto the Poison Mastery, it just makes more sense there. Next up, Cold Masteries. This one, I was kind of in the middle on. This node sounds really strong in my opinion. This node sounds really strong as well. I was in the middle on this because the curse effect chilling areas I think is extremely strong, and for Cold Dot I could see it being very good. If you're doing Vortex, if you're doing an Occultist Cold Dot, you're doing Elemental Weakness, you're doing Frostbite, you're doing multiple curses, that curse effect has some pretty distinct value. But ultimately I think overall, in terms of like cold builds in general, I think overall it was a buff. I'm a little bit unsure. I'm a little bit on the edge on this one. Not really full committed. Dagger Masteries. We traded maximum attack for a increased prod speed. I don't think there's too many builds going attack-based daggers. I don't see it like ever. So I think this is a super extremely niche thing, mostly because attack-based daggers just aren't good if you compare it to an attack-based claw. And on top of that, if I'm gonna use a dagger, there would be more likelihood of me to use it for some sort of I don't know, elemental poison based skill, something like along those lines where I'm using the poison dagger, and the more max fizz isn't great for that because you'd rather use like tri-elemental damage. And the main thing I was thinking is the prod speed node maybe means if I'm playing Spark, I'm tempted to pick up a dagger cluster just to get the prod speed to help counteract the prod speed nerf. We don't know how much the prod speed nerf was on Spark, but maybe this would be a way to counteract it. I'm not sure if it's worth the play, but to me it seems like maybe a slight buff because I don't see this ever being used. Versus chat said it was a side grade because we're trading something that's not going to be used much for something that's not going to be used much. That's kind of like the how you can think about it. Elemental Masteries. There's a disagreement between me and public opinion or chat. Chat says we're getting nerfed here. I agree. We lost good things. These are generically good. All res, effective non-damaging ailments, gain fizz as extra random element, and leech. I'd argue leech is a pretty easily replaced thing. There's leech all over the tree for energy shield for spell-based casters, and generally very few attack builds are doing attack-based leech of this, but if you are doing attack-based leech, you're probably something like a intelligence stack or an ES stacker of some sort, and you're probably going Ghost Reaver at that point, at which point you can still get energy shield leech, so I don't think that's a too big of a loss. The main losses here are the ailment effect and the all res. Now, in these cases, I think these are pretty strong. I use these on a lot of cases just to fix my res initially, and then I'm too lazy to fix my gear later on to then get this passive point power back. But what are you trading it for? And I would argue you're trading it for something that is stronger. And when I say is stronger, I'm talking about the invert and I'm talking about the gain fizzes extra. The invert mod, is specifically useful if you are a penetration build or literally just any build that isn't subtracting the boss's res down to 0. It's still going to be net positive. Now, if you have a build that does a lot of pen, something like Omni, this node here represents something close to 15% more damage. That's really strong for one passive point. If you're just lowering the enemy's resistance, you don't have a ton of pen, it's still more damage, but it helps save you when you get to monsters that have a res mod. If you've ever noticed where you're like, okay, I one-shot this rare, I one-shot this rare, I one-shot this rare, and then you run into a rare that all of a sudden takes like 50 hits or something, like it's way tankier, generally that is a combination of a more life multiplier and a specific res that is good against your damage type. This mod here would basically mean 1 out of 4 shots you one-shot that rare because you invert that high res to negative res, and it's a huge quality of life. Same thing as if you roll a bricked map where the map boss rolls a res against your damage type, or you roll a simulacrum that is res against your damage type. This is saving you in those scenarios, is basically what it's doing, which I think is quite a lot of value. That's the biggest draw, I think, to the new Masteries. But the second biggest draw, which is more niche, is Ignite-based with this mod here. I think this is a massive power spike for Ignite-based with Fizz skills. Something like EK Ignite would be able to take a large advantage of this. It is a 1 in 33 if you're a Shaper of Flames, which if you're doing Ignite, you probably should be Shaper of Flames, especially if you're a Fizz-based Shaper of Flames Ignite, because you get a 1 in 33 chance to do this. Throughout the boss fight, you're going to keep throwing, you're going to keep igniting. The important part here, though, is when you do finally hit with that 300% Fizz gain as extra Ignite, well, there's something like Defiled Forces you can have in your build, and you can just keep refreshing that Ignite duration, especially if you have a Curse on hit, which I believe works with this. I'm not 100% sure, don't quote me on it, but I think that would count as you cursing the boss over and over, and it would keep refreshing that Ultra Ignite you have on an enemy. And I just think that level of interesting power is not even close. I think a lot of these nodes, I think some of them were meant as a little bit of nerf, but I think a lot of it was they were just trying to take out just the generic boring stuff, which these nodes, if you look at this stuff, is just kind of generically boring. It's just all res, ailment effect. There's no like super interesting interaction that goes into these, where both of these nodes, they have a pretty interesting interaction, and then some of these nodes maybe they at least have a little bit more intrigue to them, even if they're not necessarily the best nodes in the game. So that's my argument behind that. Granted, it was still definitely a nerf vote by chat, so I know public opinion would disagree with me. All right, Energy Shield Masteries, buff versus buff. I initially was thinking I was going to label this as a nerf. I thought this node was pretty strong in my mind, and I was thinking, oh, Discipline Mastery, that sucks a little bit, is what I was thinking. But upon further convincing via chat giving me points. For example, this node is just objectively weaker than this node in 99% of cases. You have to have a extremely large amount of mana, like 10k mana for this to represent 300 flat ES versus a 300 flat ES helmet on this, which basically any build can have that, and there's pretty much only one build that gets this, which is a massive mana stacker. And then on top of that, the Reservation Mastery, this is one of the weakest Reservation Masteries in the game. It's 25% on Discipline, which is a smaller Reservation aura than Grace or Determination, and in exchange, we got the ability for generically, if you're more of a hybrid build, you get access to this even if you're not doing the Evasion Energy Shield Mastery, so it's in a better place. And then on top of that, this node here, I think is really cool for something like a Divine Flesh build, where you're always on full Energy Shield because you're not losing it, and then you just get 10% less Fizz taken out. So it's another way to mitigate Fizz for Divine Flesh. I think Divine Flesh won big time in this patch, by the way. This is really huge for Divine Flesh. And then the Armor node here, Armor applies the Chaos damage. This is really huge for Divine Flesh, so you're even more heavily mitigating that chaos damage. So I think Divine Flesh was a big winner on this patch for multiple reasons. Moving on, Evasion side grade. This is basically you're trading Grace for the new Suppress node. Chat thought this was a nerf. I thought this was a side grade. Grace Reservation, and this goes for all the Reservation Masteries. I think ultimately this was a side grade for the vast majority of cases, except for Precision, Vitality, Clarity, and Skitterbots. Those auras were heavier value for the reservation efficiency they were giving you in most cases, whereas the reservation aura node specific ones, they are strictly weaker than the generic mana reservation node we got back. And as you're playing around with passives, this doesn't really feel like much of a nerf unless you're a specific build that was getting like 3 of these reservation masteries, and that's I think it's a very rare case. You have to really stretch your tree to do that, and I think you're kind of making a bad build when you do, if I'm being honest. In most cases, I would say. Now, I think this node right here is strictly more powerful. 15 Suppress, I think, is way more powerful than 25% reservation efficiency on a specific aura. That being said, it is too conditional in my opinion. Having all the gear pieces be evasion, this is a common requirement to meet as an evasion character, and a lot of evasion characters are going to benefit from the Suppress, but it's still a bit too conditional. If it wasn't as conditional, I would full-heartedly believe this is a buff, whereas chat thinks this is a nerf. You can decide for yourself. Outside of that, we have Energy, Evasion, Shield, Masteries. I don't think there's much dispute on this. You're trading one okay node for 4 really good nodes. I'm really excited to make an int-stacking Trickster this league. I think these nodes will kind of juice that build, and I'm excited to do that. I'll probably do that as like a 3rd build of the league or something. It's just not really close between this stuff and this node here that we lost. And then this node got put in a more appropriate location, which is not a nerf at all. It's another place on the tree that makes more sense for it. Next up, we have Fire Masteries. This was actually, chat voted buff on this. It was a very close buff vote. I'm surprised. I thought chat was going to vote nerf solely because of the 20 dot multi and everybody thinks in damage numbers. But chat voted for buff. I put this more as a side grade. Personally, I am ecstatic about this. Leveling with Righteous Fire is one of my favorite things to do. It's a buff to basically any spellcaster I ever level in the future, and any league start where I need a go-to way to get through the early acts. Righteous Fire is going to be there to hold me. And not only is this node good for that, it's also good in the late game on basically any build, because most builds will have at least 75 res, if not higher, and that is a insignificant amount of regen. That is generally 100% worth 1 passive point to grab base 75 to 100 or even higher regen depending on your character. An example would be if you're min-maxing your build and you have a Mage Blood character. Mage Blood characters might not have a high HP pool, but they have a lot of mitigation. And what else do they have? They have a lot of free res. A Mage Blood character could easily get 200 flat regen virtually for free on their character that regen is much more impactful on. So there's examples where this scales very hard is what I would say. Not to mention at the baseline for a normal character, it's good as well. And then on top of that, we got this node here, which is roughly as strong as this node, this damage per 20 strength for a strength stacker. This is roughly comparable, but it works on pretty much every build. The main thing you get is you don't get to inherently ignite with crits, but that's okay, because if you're a crit character, you don't care about Ignite. The thing you care about is dealing 100% increased damage. So if you have a minor amount of Ignite chance, which you'll get pretty easily as you're speccing some fire nodes, there's a lot of Ignite chance all over the place. It's not too hard to pick up, and that'll just be a nice damage buff for everybody. So overall, I think this is a side grade because it moves Fire Masteries away from being just a fire dot or a strength stacker, that's like the only thing you use the Fire Masteries for, to I can generally do this in pretty much any build. I still would pick this up as a fire dot build, and I still would pick it up as a hit-based build now, which I wouldn't do before. That being said, I also need to remember recover life on ignited enemy. This node, I had a lot of people in chat tell me they love this node or something. I personally, this is a personal thing for me, I don't like building recovery based on kill effects. I want to make my character where it's good in a boss fight and it's good in mapping. And if I have sustain for a boss fight, I have sustain for mapping. The recover on life is some nice extra juice QOL, and I can admit that's good, but pretty much never am I ever picking this up, whereas some other builds, if you're a mapping specific character and you really care about mapping, that's what you do, then it's always worth it sort of thing. So this one's kind of up in the air. I don't place a lot of value in it, but that's just my thought process between these exchange of nodes. Next up, we have Flask Masteries. We both agree between me and chat, this is a nerf. You get Recover on Life, which is very, very strong if you remember the Flagellant Flask meta. Unfortunately for this node, we don't have Flagellant Flask anymore. We have a much weaker mod, and it's much harder to sustain the ability to proc your flasks a bunch on yourself. This is still going to enable some interesting builds. There's still people that are probably going to build around this, but I just don't think it is as strong as the extra generation of flash charges and the extra power of 10% flask effect. That's my personal take on it. The other things here I think are weird. This node here with the flash charge on crit thing, maybe it feels good, but I feel like whenever I've tried to invest in the flash charge on crit thing, I've never been able to notice it being an impactful like investment, like a flash charge on crit from belt or flash charge on crit from a Watcher's Eye. So myself, I'm hesitant to think I would pick this node. Basically, that's where I'm at. 4 to 5 masteries. We all agree this is a nerf, but I was mostly just going off what chat was telling me. I'm not a big fortify guy. When I've done fortify in the past, I've always been using something like Overlord or something like my melee hits fortify, so the fortify was guaranteed. And when you're losing the +3 max fortification, that is definitely a nerf fight. That's a good mastery to take. It's nice damage mitigation. And then the fortify duration, I was told, is important if you're doing fortify like a normal human being. I don't know if that's true or not, but I basically thought this is meme recovery and this other stuff just doesn't seem great. For a champion, this one maybe feels good. For other builds, when you don't have the fortify stacked up yet, it's just a weird node to build around. I wouldn't want to build around it myself. All right, Impale Masteries. This is just strictly a massive buff. This node, as if I'm understanding it correctly, is the equivalent of almost an entire additional Impale. Because if you do something like an Impale build, where you're like a champion and you have an Impale, +2 Impale or +1 Impale on your Watcher's Eye, you're getting something like 7, 8 Impales. That is 8 chances at 10% chance to add an Impale, which is roughly close to 1 additional Impale. That mastery is huge, and then on top of that, you also are getting the ability to deal all your Impale damage instantly, which I think is just strictly a damage upgrade, because you're storing all this damage on an enemy, but then you can only get that damage out of the enemy over the next 7 hits. But if you proc this mod early on, you might instantly gib an enemy that you've been stacking Impales on. Like you're doing a boss, you get the boss down to like, I don't know, 20% HP left, and then you hit once for this thing to proc, it might insta-gib the boss sort of thing. That's what I'm saying. Because normally Impale has more of a ramping feature and then it's steady. This allows you to cash in on that stored DPS. So I think both of these are actually really good nodes, and I think that's a strict buff. Leech Masteries. It's not even close. We traded 3 things for 1 thing that does the same thing, and then on top of that, we traded a little bit of damage for instant leech. If you were here during Val Pack days, you know instant leech is crazy strong. My one concern for this is it going to be capped by leech mechanics in some way that might gimp its power level? But looking at this, I feel like instant leech is kind of gonna just be nutty, I think. Not to mention there's some other interesting nodes, like this node on a Slayer is crazy to get all that extra armor and evasion, or just a build that's doing Petrified Blood. That's a good way to get armor and evasion. Very nice in my opinion. And then there's some other weird ones, like the 25% more damage against enemies that cannot leech. I'm not sure if there's a way to force this to be true. If there is, that's a really crazy mastery, but I'm not sure how you force it. And then the recoup, 25% of damage taken, recouped his life if Leech was removed by filling. This basically, what this does, in my opinion, is it makes it so builds that aren't over Leech builds, but they just have Leech in their build, this is really strong, I think. So you're trading like some relatively mess stuff for just bangers all the way through. The Leech Masteries are crazy. Lightning Masteries. This is an example of a heavy nerf, in my opinion. You get some crit chance, which is decent, but it's conditional on lightning exposure, which is weird. And then you get lightning damage of enemies hitting you while you're shocked as unlucky, which is also very specific, very weird. And what you're trading it for was the two best masteries, in my opinion, that were on Lightning Masteries, Lucky and the Chain. You get the Lucky back on the Amulet, but that doesn't really feel great. And the Chain was pretty important for a lot of characters. Personally, this is an example where I'd say Leech Masteries got Giga buffed, Lightning Masteries got Giga nerfed. And versus some ones where it's only slightly a buff or slightly a nerf, this is kind of like more of a contrast type of thing. Life Masteries is an example of, in my opinion, a Giga buff. All these nodes are very, very, very strong. And then all these nodes are respectively weaker by quite a lot, in my opinion. The Vitality Reservation is a little bit meh, but this node allows you to be considered full life while doing Vitality on your life pool. So some conditions where you're like damage on full life, for example, or other conditions that require you to be on full life, like full life to do suppress, stuff like that, that still triggers even if you are reserving a bit of your life to do Vitality, which is what I normally do on a lot of builds, is I put Arrogance on my Vitality. I think that's a good way to go about it. Usually better than putting Vitality on your mana pool, in my opinion. Link Masteries, I didn't even look at these. I don't care. Maybe there's something good there. Maybe there's something not. I'm not even going to look at it. Then we got Mana Masteries. Frankly, it would be probably counted as a buff most likely, but I'm not even looking at it. It's a Link Mastery. I don't know. Maybe it'll be usable someday by someone. I just don't care. Mana Masteries. This is a strict buff. It's not even close. Mana Reservation Efficiency just basically completely outweighs all of the reservation efficiency nerfs on the other random specific nodes. I think I like this idea of putting Mana Reservation on mana. I think it's appropriately the right place for it to be, and that allowed for those other masteries to get cool nodes in return, like Max Res on Armor, or like Suppress on Grace. You start to get stuff that more synergizes or makes sense with the specific type of thing, rather than just something that's let's stack auras, and let's shoehorn everybody into it. Mind Masteries. This is just a buff. It's not even close. This is the AoE node on Saboteur, which AoE was the best part of that node, in my opinion. And now everybody gets access to it. I think that's very cool. The Skitterbot CDR is a little bit of a slight nerf to something, but I just think this is strictly better. So I think that's a buff. Chat thought it was a buff. We move on. Mark Masteries. Chat thought this was a buff. I think overall it's a nerf. I like these nodes, but at the same time, I think Mark Effect is just better. I think Mark Effect is just strictly better than all of these. And if I'm taking a Mark cluster, I'm usually only taking one of those Mark clusters. So I guess realistically, previously I would be more tempted to take two and get Frenzy and Mark Effect. Now I think I just take one and I take Frenzy type of thing. I don't know. I'm kind of in the middle. They did put Mark Effect in some new clusters on the tree, so it like counterbalances, but this one's a little weird for me. I think this is a nerf. I think it's a slight nerf, but it's a nerf. Physical Masteries. I put this as a side grade. Chat put this as a buff. The reason I put this as a side grade is I think the chance to impale is valuable, and I think the Lingering Blades, I don't understand why that got nerfed. Maybe this is getting added back somewhere else that I don't understand, but to me it just looks like blade skills with Lingering Blades got nerfed for why, I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. I hope they maybe get the buff somewhere else, but I don't know. This seems like a weird nerf in that way regard. You get some cool stuff in return, which is basically the more max fizz, which is a nice damage multiplier. You get the ability to ignore monsters res 40% of the time, which is a little bit stronger than this, or actually a decent amount stronger than Overwhelm. The issue I have is with simply the Lingering Blades thing. That's why I think it's a side grade, because you're trading basically some good things for some good things. I maybe lean more towards nerf, to be honest, just because I don't understand why blade skills took this nerf. It doesn't make sense to me. Chat thought it was a buff, though. I don't know why, but they thought it was a buff. Poison Masteries. Chat thinks this is a nerf. I think this is a side grade. It's simply a scenario where you're trading damage for defense. I value the ability to make enemies not crit me. Chat values poison duration. That's pretty much what it comes down to. I don't think poison builds are struggling for damage. I think you're hitting dot cap in a lot of cases without too much struggle, without too much investment. I don't think you need this, and this is a very nice way to get basically mitigation against crit. Very, very well is what I would say. Protection Masteries. I put this as a buff. Chat put this as a nerf. I think if we're just looking at this at base value, these two nodes, who cares? No one cares about this, no one cares about this, no one cares about this, no one cares about this. Well, actually, somebody might care about the curse thing. The curse thing is kind of up in the air. Somebody might care about that if you want to have... basically, say you're grabbing this to overcap, this might be technically more valuable if you're considering the scenario where you get cursed with, like, flammability and elemental weakness. That's definitely going to do more than 12 all-res. So this is strictly maybe better than this if you're worried about overcapping. But I was looking at this node. This node here to me seems the strongest out of the bunch. Normally, I think you're getting one Protection Mastery. You're grabbing Corrupted Blood immunity until you get a Corrupted Blood Jewel. Then, realistically, you're switching for either the Cannot Be Lowered by Curses or this node over here, which, as I understand this, this is basically a way to mitigate poison 100%, because if you get a map mod for poison, the way you die is you take multiple poisons. If you only get one poison on you, you're probably not dying, and then this is going to save you from dying to poison. Not only that, but there's some interesting builds you can make with this. I'm thinking specifically of a Golden Rule Ice Fang Orbit self-chill build. If I do a build with that specific combination, I inflict one poison on myself, I inflict one chill on myself, and all of a sudden I am immune to ailments from every other ailment, and I get no damaging ailments. I think that's crazy cool for basically ways to build an interesting character. Granted, there is some weirdness or awkwardness to this. Say randomly the poison falls off. There's a split window where you're in the middle of an attack, but the boss hits you right before that, and then they hit you and they get you with a freeze or something weird. Yes, there could be that scenario, but I think it's going to be the way that sort of character plays, I think it's going to be very rare that that happens. I could be wrong, but I think there's some interesting things you can do with that, and I think this is way, way cooler than just 12 all-res. 12 all-res isn't interesting. You can get it literally anywhere. This is a unique stat that you couldn't get anywhere else, is what I'm thinking, basically. Recovery Masteries, this is just all new power creep. This is all buffs. Not much to say there. Reservation Masteries, this is strictly a buff. We got the ability to get 1 max all LE res. In a lot of builds, just a buff. And then what do we have next? We have Suppression. I had a lot of debate with chat on this one between this node and this node. I would argue Lucky Suppress is better in 99% of cases. Lucky Suppress acts on a bell curve of power. Essentially, you're looking at anywhere from 9 Suppress to 25 Suppress at the peak. At 50 Suppress, this is giving you 25 Suppress effectively, which is much stronger than this. And not only that, it has no condition. You do not have to have your gloves, boots, and helmet all have evasion. It's unconditional. You can do this no matter what your gear is, which that is, in my opinion, definitely a strict buff. There was a lot of builds I made where I couldn't even grab this node because I had some specific key unique for my build that doesn't have the evasion stat, right? So conditionally, it's better. And then also I had a debate with people about, essentially, there are people that like to say 100 suppress or nothing. If you don't have 100 suppress, it's worthless. Because Lucky Suppress is the scenario where you can never fully get perfectly 100% suppress until you've capped without it. AKA, say if you have 80 suppress, it's effectively 96. And they would say 96% suppress is worthless. I think that's a load of crap. I think in hardcore, you can say that. Because in hardcore, one death ends your career. But in softcore, the amount of times you're going to die because you only have a 4% chance to get hit without the suppress activating is very, very, very low. Especially if you've made your character well, you should be able to tank a non-suppressed hit and then tank the next hit, which is going to be suppressed. The odds of you getting hit by twice in a row with 2 non-suppressed hits is very, very, very low, right? So if you die once in softcore, it's not the end of the world. It doesn't matter that much, and this allows you to have a character that doesn't have crazy insane gear, get very good suppress. That's my main argument. In hardcore, I also think it's good in hardcore because initially when you're gearing your character, it takes you a while to get the gear necessary to be suppressed. And until then, this is going to carry you because this is going to be 25 suppress to basically 9 suppress until you've gotten that gear scaled, and it's going to carry you a lot harder than this is while not being gear specific. And you could have a helmet with armor that has good stats and you're leveling, and I don't know. I think you're crazy if you think this node is weaker than this one. I think you're just legitimately, you're crazy. That being said, the other stuff here, I will say this, the exposure, you get a triple exposure. This is a rare thing. I don't see too many ways to get this. This is a side note. If you're a tri-elemental build, like Brittle, Scorch type of thing, or just Trinity in general, this node's actually really good because generally when you're those types of characters, you don't even bother with getting exposure because you only get like exposure for fire or exposure for cold. This gives you a way to get tri-exposure. I would plan on making a character that can tank stuff, and I would just plan on tanking enemies and having them give me spells to suppress back to them to give them -10 res to give me a lot more damage. So I think this is actually pretty cool. That's a side note. Ultimately, you compare all these nodes, at the end of the day, the crit chance node is just stronger. It's just stronger. And that's why I'm calling it a nerf. I'm calling it a nerf only because the crit chance node is stronger. It's just ridiculous to get 100% increased crit chance for one mastery. Ultimately, I think it's probably healthier for the game to not have 100% crit chance be tied to suppress one of the easiest and strongest defensive kits in the game. So I think it makes sense, but ultimately it still is a nerf. Buff to stun masteries. This seems like a pretty good buff to like bone zone for AoE. I'm not sure about the other stuff. Maybe crit multi for against stun and enemies. That could be a strong node. I don't really know what to think about this. It's just more power that we didn't have before. Trap masteries. I think strictly this is a nerf. This was one of the best reservation nodes on the tree, and this is one of the cases where I won't say yes, the mana reservation outweighs it, because it doesn't. This is a very, very strong reservation in exchange for a good damage node, but I think this is ultimately probably stronger, so I think I put this as a nerf. Side grade for two-handed masteries. It technically is like an additional thing for two-handed masteries, but it's something we already had, so I'm just going to put it as side grade, and I'm still not sure if it's even one you use. And then last but not least, Warcry masteries. This is similar to like Lightning Masteries, Chaos Masteries. It just is weird to me that why is this getting a nerf is kind of like the question that boggles my mind, because I don't understand the Lightning Mastery nerf, I don't understand the Chaos Mastery nerf, and I don't understand the Warcry Mastery nerf, because like we got like 3 things that like the Warcry cannot exert travel skills used to have 25% damage. Why they just took off 25% damage on a node that like is just kind of weird to begin with. It just seems weird. I don't know why. I don't know what's going on there. Outside of this stuff, we have the Ascendancy balance now. Ascendancy balance was basically all buffs except for Trap Saboteurs. Trap Saboteurs lost their percent damage per trap, they lost their cooldown recover, they lost their CDR, and they lost their chance to trigger an additional trap. Trap Sabos got dunked on. Traps is probably just going to be better as an Inquisitor, as a Pathfinder, as an Occultist. You probably don't play Traps as a Saboteur unless you really care about area of effect. Outside of that, the Mine Saboteur got strictly side graded / buffed. They lost 25% mine throw speed, which I think is just weaker than the other options they can now pick now. So I think they got buffed because they got the mastery that got put for AoE on the actual like tree. So I think it's a buff / side grade for Mine Sabo. And then a buff for the Trigger Saboteur. A completely new archetype, a completely new way to build characters. There's probably going to be some interesting use cases for this, and I'm excited to see what people come up with this specific setup. I think it could be the best cast and crit Ascendancy. We will see. Pathfinder itself, 5 ways to Sunday. It's not even close. This Enduring Life Last thing is going to be insane. I think it's just a crazy buff. The Wither thing's a buff. The Flask Effect magic thing, that kind of got buffed. The weird thing was the Master Distiller node. That was just weird. I don't think that's going to see like any use at all. And then we traded basically the nodes that weren't very good. This node got buffed because you got more Flask Effect. You did get the Remove Elemental Amulet. That got kind of shifted around because you got the 50% chance to not consume charges. That got a little bit weird, but ultimately, I just don't think it's close. I think the new Pathfinder is just way, way better. I think it's the best Ascendancy in the game now. I could be wrong, but I think it's the best Ascendancy in the game now. Ascendant Pathfinder got strictly buffed. We got Remove Bleed, as well as a higher chance to not consume, and we got this on the Mastery tree, so we didn't lose anything. It's just strictly a buff. Ascendant Saboteur. This is a side grade. Now it's not good for traps, but now it's really good for builds that care about CDR. There's probably going to be some ascendancies. I think Saboteur on Ascendant's going to be picked up more now, but the old use case, which was for traps, they definitely lost a very important regen node. Outside of that, Ascendant Hyro got a strict little buff, and Hierophant essentially got 40 to 60% cast speed based on the Arcane Surge changes and the Ascendancy change on Hierophant. So, that levels out our Ascendancy changes. Leveling. This is a big contentious thing that mattered to way more people than I ever thought it would, or at least there was a vocal amount of people that it mattered to. Realistically, this boils down to racers doing the campaign somewhere between 10 to 30 minutes slower. And for people that aren't racers, it boils down to us doing the campaign basically at the same speed, in my opinion. I never was big on doing the vendor recipe, and even when I did the vendor recipe, I do a practice run where I do the vendor recipe, and I do a practice run where I don't do the vendor recipe, and I do the same amount of time for Act 1, which is when it matters the most, in my opinion, and then I get Act 2 with Righteous Fire for any build, which is going to be a giga boost speed. Like, the amount of time it takes somebody that's a noob or somebody that's not good at managing their inventory like me, it adds up. And it counterbalances the time I save for killing Merveil a little bit faster. So for me, and for I think the vast majority of players, I don't think this matters. I think it's just kind of shifting the leveling meta is what it's doing. And we don't know how the new gems will play into leveling. Maybe it's a buff, maybe it's not. The Momentum trailer kind of seemed like a meme. It almost seemed like April Fools, like maybe they're going to pull the curtain over us and they're going to say, oh, by the way, we aren't getting rid of Onslaught. That was just an April Fool's joke. We wanted to make this Momentum video, and I don't freaking know. Next up, we have miscellaneous nerfs and buffs. Arcane Surge, you traded 1% more damage for 1% cast speed sort of thing. That's the stats. You're trading 1% or more spell damage, just a more valuable stat than cast speed. For Hierophant, you specifically buffed from this because you got the more percent damage on your tree, and then you got cast speed as a net buff. For Molten Shell, it's 100% a nerf, and it's 100% deserved. Molten Shell is so ubiquitously way stronger than every other option, and quite frankly, it still is the strongest option, and it still is very good. Very good. 100% deserve the nerf. I don't feel bad about that at all. I think I think this is something that was a long time coming, is what I expected this to get nerfed a long time ago. And I think basically a lot of people just kept expecting the Molten Shell nerf, and then it never happened, and we stopped putting it on the we expect this to get nerfed because it just didn't seem like GG was going to nerf it, and then I guess they finally decided to. Things I know about: Fortify Wheel, the percent damage got changed. You lost 70% damage and you got 30% armor evasion in return. I think this is a nerf. Ultimately, this wheel, I had a hard time justifying most of my builds, so I don't think it's that big of a deal. I usually could path around it and get other nodes, but if you were picking this up, this is a damage nerf. Fortify Wheel with max Fortify, you got basically 2.5% regen as a buff, so that's just net buff for you. For that wheel, some extra regen, doesn't feel too bad. Culling Strike Mark Wheel, that wheel got nerfed, the small nodes got weaker. The other Mark Wheels they added, they have two different changed Mark Wheels that are better now, and then there's one Mark Wheel that just doesn't make sense. It's like got Mark cast speed and no one's ever going to grab that wheel ever. At least I don't see it happening. We'll see though, maybe they do. Cast on Stun builds got buffed, but is that actually a build? Who knows? Infinite Heist, Infinite Harvest, they got nerfed. I think for the most part, this will just encourage people to play the real game and have fun playing the real game. I know people think Infinite Heist is the end-all be-all for making currency, but you can make a ton of currency just by doing maps. People might not realize it, but getting into maps faster does make a lot of currency. And quite frankly, in most cases, it's going to make more currency than Infinite Heist. Infinite Heist falls off very quickly, and by the time most of us have gotten to Infinite Heist, the value of Infinite Heist has fallen off, I think, for the vast majority of people. But that's just my own opinion. And I don't like Heist, right? I am biased. Heist is just so unfun, and I think the real game is fun. Infinite Harvest, this is, I think, a nerf to the... I'm assuming this is a nerf to the people that bought the 50 Divine Sextant. So this is, like, so far above... Like, this is the 1% player base that was doing this. I don't know if it matters too much. Maybe it matters a lot. We'll see what it does to the economy. I don't know. And then... Vengeance Cascade buff. This is a massive buff to bow builds and wand builds. Absolutely huge. Power Charge. This is a nice little buff for everybody. And then the stuff here didn't really make sense. I had a hard time reading paragraph on the proj mechanics, but from what I understand, it seems like a slight nerf to Nimbus Clear and a slight nerf to Nimbus Single Target, specifically single target with like Creeping Frost or Caustic Arrow where you target the ground. I think Fireball is still going to be insane. I think you're still going to have a crazy amount of overlapping hit damage, but Creeping Frost, you can't just target the ground and hit twice is what I believe this meant, but it was still a little bit confusing. Next up, you have Atlas Warp Gates. This is just a buff to everybody's Atlas trees. It saves you a ton of points. I'm really excited to plan around this. I think that's one of the most awesome changes that they did, and it was a great idea. Skill Balance. This one was basically a leveling nerfs, a nerf for Poison Concoction, a nerf for Explosion Concoction, which maybe it's better with Ignite now, and I have no idea what the hell's going on with Tendies. Somebody else can do the math to see if this makes sense as a buff in some build. I have no clue. And then a buff to Spectre Throw, and a nerf to Spark. This was like a pretty much, I think this is just more along the lines of leveling nerfs, but it was mostly overall buffs, except for Spark, which is kind of a very, very good skill. And then obviously the nerf to Poison Concoction was pretty hefty. I still think Poison Concoction, I still think it's a really, really good leveling ability. I still think it's actually S tier leveling, but it's not like S plus tier, like the thing I'm going to recommend to every single person. It's just going to be like, yeah, you can level this Poison Concoction. It's going to be good, but it's going to fall off in endgame. Don't play it into endgame is what I'm going to say, because it already was falling off in endgame. Now it's definitely falling off in endgame. And then you get 9 new Val skills. People might say it's just a new thing, it's not a buff, but realistically, every single time you consider an ability with a Val skill, it strictly is more damage, more clear. It is a buff. That's the only way you can usually read this thing. I'll give you some examples. Val Righteous Fire, I click that on. It's more damage and more clear. Val Blade Vortex, more damage, more clear. And you go down the list. There's going to be some Val skills that are strictly like they aren't very good, but all the skills they mentioned, I'm guessing, are just buffs to those skills, except for maybe Rejuvenation Totem. Unless Val Rejuvenation Totem is just nasty, I don't think people are going to put that in their gem slots. We'll see. But yeah, moving on. Items. This was just a bunch of buffs for the most part, and then a nerf rate to Diadem and Loyal, and a small nerf to the Poison Minion builds where they lost a bit of their percent damage, as far as I understand. Everything else here was massive buffs to the Breach items and massive buffs to the Abyss Uniques. I cannot wait to make builds with these new, basically buffed unique items. So overall, a bunch of buffs in the items, except for basically some drop rate nerfs, which means Diadem's going to be pretty expensive, probably. And we're just guessing. We don't know how rare it's going to be, but my guess, it went from a 50% drop rate to probably like a 1 in 10 to 1 in 50. I don't think it's worth the drop rate of an Ashes. I don't. I think Ashes is much, much, much better than Diadem. So I would be very surprised if it's a 1 in 50. I'm guessing it's going to be a 1 in 10, but it will still be expensive on League Start / later in the game, because it still is a very good helmet. After all of this, guys, I know it's a long thing to go through. I counted up all these things in terms of the masteries. Chat voted for 12 nerfs and 2 side grades. I voted for 9 nerfs and 5 side grades. So there's a lot of those nerfs I thought were very close to basically just being kind of dead even. And then chat and I mostly agreed about 20 masteries were buffed. Ultimately, you count all this stuff up, it's roughly double the amount of buffs in comparison to nerfs. And then somewhere in the middle, there's like maybe 3 to 10 side grades where it's pretty neutral, where the buff was only a slight buff or the nerf was only a slight nerf. If you're calling this a nerf patch, you're just, I don't think you're being realistic about all the power we got in various places. None of this considers the power we're getting in Crucible, which is crazy definite power creep. There's no other way to look at it. If you see the possibilities of things on those Crucible trees, they're definitely power creep. The big question is, how rare is the good stuff, right? So that will basically play into how much power creep Crucible is, and will Crucible go Legacy? If Crucible goes Legacy, then it's just a bunch of power creep, and we're looking at a lot of juice this league, I think. So overall, I wanted to make this video to go over everything I could find for nerfs and buffs. There's definitely stuff I missed in terms of like tree changes. Like, I didn't even mention the fact that there's +2 proj on the tree now, where previously there was +0 proj on the tree. That's a buff, right? I didn't even mention that. There are things I forgot to go over. There's probably nerfs I missed. You can make that assumptions for yourself, but in a 7-hour stream, we went through as many stuff as we could, and we're coming away with over twice the ratio of buffs to nerfs. And ultimately, I think the buffs are stronger buffs than the nerfs are in terms of how much power the nerfs are getting. Like, I think the buffs, they're not only double the count, I think they're worth more. The like the stuff we're getting in return, I think, is more powerful, I would argue. Maybe this gets you excited for the league and realizing I can make some cool things. Maybe there's some things in here you didn't realize was in there or didn't realize the potential of. All in all, hopefully you guys have a fun time in Crucible League. I'm freaking stoked for it. The next video I'm going to make is going to be for the Holy Relic build guide, and I hope you guys enjoy it. As always, take care, Exiles, and peace out.